You're doing the dishes, or driving, or lying in bed with the lights off, and somewhere in the last 4 minutes, you left. Not physically, you're still standing there, hands in soapy water, but you're actually in a conversation that isn't happening, telling off a coworker who wronged you in 2019, or accepting an award for a book you haven't written, or explaining calmly and devastatingly to an ex exactly why they were wrong. None of it is real. All of it feels, for a few seconds, completely necessary. And if you've ever caught yourself mid-imaginary argument and felt a flicker of embarrassment, like you'd been caught doing something a little unhinged, I want to tell you up front, you're not broken, and you're definitely not alone. There's actually a name for what your brain is doing, and once you understand the mechanism, the embarrassment mostly evaporates. Let's start with what's actually happening when you drift into one of these scenes. Psychologists call this maladaptive daydreaming when it's extreme, but the milder, near-universal version is simply called self-generated thought, and it activates something specific in the brain called the default mode network. This is the set of regions that light up precisely when you're not focused on a task in front of you, when your mind is, by every outward appearance, doing nothing. Except it isn't doing nothing. Neuroscientists using fMRI have found the default mode network is almost shockingly active during idle moments, running simulations, replaying memories, auditioning futures. Your brain, when it's off, is actually one of the busiest versions of itself. It just redirected the busyness inward. Here's the part that reframes everything. This isn't your brain malfunctioning or you failing to be present. Simulation is one of the primary jobs of a healthy human mind. Psychologist Jerome Singer, who spent decades studying daydreaming starting in the 1960s, found that the vast majority of people, upward of 96% in some of the samples, engage in vivid fantasy regularly, and that it's tied to creativity, planning, and emotional regulation, not dysfunction. The people who never do this, who genuinely cannot conjure an imagined scenario, tend to score lower on measures of empathy and future planning. Which means the ability to vanish into a fake argument in your kitchen is, structurally, the same cognitive machinery that lets you plan for a job interview or imagine how someone else feels. You're not broken, you're using the tool correctly, just aiming at somewhere embarrassing. So why the arguments specifically? Why do so many people's minds default to imaginary conflict rather than imaginary vacations? This is where it gets a little uncomfortable, because it's more personal than people want to admit. A lot of imagined confrontations are what psychologists call unfinished business rehearsal. Something happened, you didn't get to say the thing, and your brain, unsatisfied with how the real version ended, keeps reopening the file to try a better draft. There's a well-documented phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect, named after psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who noticed in the 1920s that people remember unfinished or interrupted tasks far better than completed ones. An open loop nags at the mind in a way a closed one never does. An argument you actually finished, out loud, in the moment, mostly stays finished. An argument you walked away from with your real response arriving 3 hours too late, that one stays open indefinitely, and your brain will keep dragging you back into the room to try again.
And this is where the shame usually creeps in, because rehearsing a conversation that isn't happening can feel like proof you're overly sensitive, or stuck in the past, or incapable of letting things go. But here's the reframe. What you're doing in that imagined scene is closer to emotional rehearsal than obsession. You're not stuck, exactly. You're practicing. Athletes visualize the shot before they take it, and their brains respond almost identically whether the movement is real or imagined, activating overlapping motor regions either way. Your mind is doing the emotional equivalent, testing out a version of confidence or boundary setting or clarity that you didn't get to access in the moment it actually mattered. The imagined argument isn't always about the past, it's often a rehearsal space for a version of you that responds better next time. But there's another layer to this, because not everyone who does this is replaying old conflict. Some people build entire alternate lives, full conversations with people who don't exist, entire relationships, entire careers, played out in vivid, specific detail while folding laundry. This has been studied too, and researchers have found it clusters more heavily in people who experienced early loneliness or long stretches of unsupervised time as children, kids who had to generate their own company because no one else was providing it. If you spent long afternoons as a child with nobody around, your brain likely got very good very early at manufacturing rich internal worlds simply because the external one wasn't offering enough stimulation. That skill doesn't disappear once other people show up in your life. It just goes quiet in company and comes back out the moment you're alone again, like a muscle that never atrophied because you never stopped using it. There's also a version of this that isn't about the past at all, but about control. Real conversations are unpredictable. People interrupt you, misunderstand you, respond in ways you didn't script. Imagined ones don't. In your head, you always land the perfect line at the perfect moment. Psychologists refer to this pull toward imagined scenarios as a form of cognitive control seeking, and it tends to show up more in people with higher anxiety around real-time social interaction, not because they're worse at conversation, but because real conversation carries a risk their imagined version never will. If you've ever noticed that your fake arguments are eloquent in a way your real ones rarely are, that's not a coincidence. That's the entire appeal. You're not just replaying the past, you're rewriting the odds. Now, before you start diagnosing yourself with something, it's worth saying clearly, doing this occasionally, even doing it a lot, is not automatically a problem. The research draws a fairly clean line. It becomes something worth paying attention to only when the imagined world starts actively displacing the real one, when someone repeatedly chooses the fantasy over an available real conversation, or loses meaningful chunks of time to it daily in a way that interferes with actual functioning. For the overwhelming majority of people, though, this is simply what an active, associative, emotionally attentive mind does with unstructured time. It's the same mental architecture that makes you a good storyteller or unusually good at anticipating how a conversation with someone difficult might go, or quick to notice when someone's tone doesn't match their words.
So, the next time you catch yourself back in that argument that never happened, correcting the record for an audience that exists only in your head, you don't need the flicker of embarrassment. What you're actually doing is something closer to maintenance. You're closing an open loop your brain refused to let go of, or rehearsing a version of yourself that responds a little braver next time, or simply exercising a capacity for imagination that never really switched off because it was never designed to. The scenario wasn't real, but what it was building in you, quietly, in the middle of doing the dishes, absolutely was. If this sounded familiar, you might also recognize yourself in why some people replay entire conversations for days afterward, analyzing every word long after everyone else has moved on. That's a different mechanism, and it's worth understanding too.